Testing.
Oh, that's better. Whoa, that's much better. All right. All right, thank you all. Okay, well, we'll just carry on. I think most of you were aware back in January, NOAA and NASA sort of announced that once again, the sort of global temperatures reached a new record. In fact, not only did it sort of eclipse the previous record of 2014, it sort of shattered that record. So that's really, I think, the issue, the events that are motivating our workshop today. You know, what are we going to do about this? Temperatures are rising. It's time to sort of move on with this. Now, one response to this change in our climate, the USDA has sort of started several years ago, were the climate hubs. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the climate hubs. There are a number of representatives here from the Northeast Hub, as well as our National Director, Randy Johnson, and Rachel Steele, who are sitting up here. If you want to know more about the climate hubs during the meeting, we would love to sort of talk to you about that. I'd ask everybody that's involved in the climate hubs now to maybe raise their hand so you know some people you can check with. We'd love to work with more of you. And as you can see up here, I have the mission of the hubs up. Although the hubs have spent a lot of time discussing sort of how we adapt to climate change, mitigation is also right, in fact, in the names of the climate hub. So we are delighted that another task that the USDA has given us to deal with climate changes is to host these mitigation workshops. And there have been regional workshops. I think we're more than halfway through the various regions, and this is our turn in the Northeast. And I really want to take this opportunity to thank all of you that are, you know, giving up your time to participate today and tomorrow in this. This is really something, because this workshop is going nowhere without all of us, or all of you anyway. So this is 3 choices for dealing within agriculture to deal with climate change. These are really choices that you know, pretty obvious. We're going to either mitigate climate change, do something to reduce the greenhouse gases, which are actually bringing this whole process about, or we're going to adapt to the change that's already underway, or as Bill Hohenstein says, we're going to suffer. And I think the reality is we're going to do all of these things. And it's an issue right now that is primarily not a scientific issue. I'm going to go off the sort of off the map here a little bit and say, but honestly, this is a political issue, not in the sort of political party issue, but in the sort of more general terms where our sort of representatives decide that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with and enact laws and regulations both nationally and internationally to deal with this, because the science is very well established. In a nutshell, you know, this is the issue. There are certain gases that trap the heat radiation, and these gases are increasing. These are all of our greenhouse gases. Lots of times, some people seem to think that this is a bad intentional thing, but clearly, you know, the release of these gases and the sort of consequent climate change, it's inadvertent. It's something that has just happened as we've gone forward and our society has progressed, and we've done a lot of the good things that we want to do. The thing that really encourages me about this issue, even though we are not at the point politically of dealing with it, is that there are a number of terrific examples of similar problems, smaller in scope, but still very similar in terms of their kind of complicated scientific basis. And they are, in fact, due to sort of human activities, but science has sort of identified a problem. They've sort of shown the way to a solution. And then the political process has enacted legislation, which has really, if not solved the problem, is bringing the problem to solution. And I list a few examples. I mean, the sort of banning of DDT was a great early example. Other more recent examples are all the Clean Air sort of Act and those laws, which have tremendously reduced the surface levels of ozone. Acid rain is not nearly as acidic as it was. Many lakes that were damaged are now recovering. And even the ozone hole. Again, a certain class of chemicals was banned, and the ozone hole is getting better slowly. So we have these great examples of how the process can work. So I'm really encouraged that even though we're not here yet, we're well on our way. And in fact, we already are on our way. Within this country, greenhouse gas emissions are already declining. Partly that is because of government policies. Partly that's because of, I guess I would say, luck. There's been a large change in electrical generation, for example, from coal to natural gas, which is due to the sort of gas that's been discovered by fracking. And for the same amount of electricity, natural gas is a much better fuel. There are issues if the natural gas methane sort of escapes along the way and adds to the greenhouse effect. But just last week, the administration announced new rules to sort of reduce the losses of methane from fracking. So that's a great sort of example. Another great example is, this is just another sort of slide from the Energy Information Agency of the US, looking at the new generation, new electrical power generation within this country. And those top two lines, those are the results for the last 2 years. The brown lines on the top are the new sort of natural gas generation, which is sort of probably only 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions of coal. The yellow are the new solar capacity, and green is new wind capacity. And down there on the bottom is coal. So the country is already sort of moving, basically due to market forces, a little bit of government sort of incentives on the solar side and the wind side, I suppose. But nowadays, even without these incentives, people are making these investments. So it's not really all gloom and doom. We're already sort of making changes and reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases. And the same applies for some of the other large emitters. China has the largest, sort of both the largest solar and wind installed capacity in the world. So we're all kind of making these motions. Also, the sort of your cars now, they get much better mileage than they used to. This is another great thing, government regulations, but this is absolutely leading to reductions in greenhouse gases as well. What all this means, though, is that as greenhouse gas emissions drop in other sectors of the economy, that the emissions from agriculture take a larger share. So that really puts the onus on us to then consider greenhouse gases within agriculture and just doing our part as well. So that's kind of my little, my rah-rah speech, why we got to go out there and do this all. Now I'll just talk a little bit about the Northeast itself. So this is because, after all, this is the Northeast Greenhouse Gas Mitigation Workshop. Agriculturally, the Northeast is kind of interesting. We don't get too much respect from the Midwest, because it's true that certain states out there, their total agricultural production is larger than all of the Northeast put together. But on the other hand, of the sort of climate hub regions, this is the region with the largest population. So we have, the most, the greatest representation within Congress as well. So disproportionately large population for the amount of the farmland that we have. And I would say we also have, I guess, less than our share of farmers, but we still value their contributions highly, and we'll discuss that in just a little bit more detail here in a minute. And down at the bottom, you can see that really the agricultural economy in the Northeast is, although it's dominated by a few different sort of commodities, dairy products, poultry, and also hay and corn, it is, of all the regions in the country, it's the most diverse. There are over 120 sort of commodities that NASS tracks within our region that actually sort of contribute significantly. And now what I thought I would do is just, I know our time is a little bit limited, but I'm going to just click through a few slides from the National Agricultural Statistics Service. They have great figures. I'm sure many of you are familiar with those. I've picked out a few that highlight some of the differences of the Northeast from other regions. And I'll go through these quickly because we really want to keep moving and get onto the workshops themselves. But one of the issues is that the average size of farms in the Northeast is smaller than most other regions. You can see that by the color, the light color, the darker the green, the larger the farms. I think farms in the Northeast are about 170 acres. Maybe somebody from NASS here can sort of correct me, but less than the national average. Another interesting fact is that the average age of farmers in the Northeast is a bit lower, a bit younger than in other parts of the country. Another kind of interesting fact in the Northeast, there's a much larger percentage of women operators of farms than in most other regions of the country. And sort of the one other aspect of farming in the Northeast is that there is a greater percentage of sort of organic production in the Northeast than any other section of the country. And that percentage of organic production is rising faster in the Northeast than in any other part of the country. And then finally, this one, I'm not sure how well that shows up. The red dots refer to farms that are disappearing. So a reduction in the number of farms. The blue dots refer or show places where farm numbers are increasing. In the Northeast, sort of an interesting pattern, I'm not exactly sure why, is that the number of farms is increasing more in the northern half of that region in New England, especially in Connecticut, if you look at that, which is kind of neat. But sort of decreasing elsewhere as farms get consolidated or as farmers retire and aren't able to find somebody in the family or elsewhere to take over the business. And that is the sort of sociology of this is certainly an important issue as well. I already mentioned commodities, so I'll just kind of skip through this really quickly. Again, the farming in the Northeast is dominated by dairy, which is a terrific thing. This is the sort of milk cow inventory across the country. And I think each dot represents 2,000 cows. So you can count them all up if you want to know what the national inventory is. But of course, with all those dairy cows, you also have the issue that's very relevant to our meeting today of manure sort of application to fields and just manure management. And again, you can see that across the region. So this is just a couple of quick slides, which I won't really spend too much time, but just looking at the value of the different commodities. This is the value of milk across the East. You can see it's more on the inland part of the Northeast. Poultry, very important down in this part of the East, in Northeast, in Delaware and Maryland. And one other aspect about the Northeast, which is kind of neat, is horticulture plays a much larger proportion of the agricultural economy than anywhere else in the country, especially in New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, some of these states. So that kind of takes me to the end here. I really feel strongly that this climate change issue, I know this sounds a little bit like rah, rah, rah stuff, but honestly, this is for real. This is a real challenge for all of us. And when I say our generation, I mean the people that are alive and able to do something about it now, because otherwise our kids or grandkids aren't going to be very forgiving of what we're doing. As we all know, there's a very strong scientific consensus about the cause of climate change, what's happening. But that also means there's a very clear understanding of what needs to be done to sort of change that. And mitigation is of course, one of the most important things that we need to do. There have been other environmental problems that are complicated, difficult, and have sort of lobbies either for or against them, but we have, they're great examples of dealing with environmental problems. And I think, as you know, it's such a broad problem that this is something that's going to have to involve all sectors of the economy. So I really appreciate your time listening to me here, and I just sort of want to charge you to go forward and do great things in your various workshops and your sessions. So thank you very much. And I guess, should I take questions or should I introduce Dave?
I'll introduce Dave.
Okay, all right, Michelle. Fantastic.
Thanks, Dave. He's taller than me, obviously. Thanks a lot. That was great. I love the NAS, those NAS graphs, but I'm a scientist, so you know that's what we like, data. Next up, and I might need some help from our technical guru in the back on the presentation. Oh, there you go. That makes it easier. Do we want to, can we change the screen while Dave's speaking? Oh, there. I'm sorry, I'm looking down here. Thank you very much. Next up is Dave Cleaves, who is a retired, correct? Dave, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. You'll do a much better job than I'm going to do. Dave Cleaves is a very retired, come on up, NRCS, correct? He's going to give us a historical perspective on the U.S. involvement in greenhouse gas mitigation and climate change in general.
Good morning. How are you all? Yeah, I'm Dave Cleaves, retired from the U.S. Forest Service about 1 year and 3 months ago. When the folks asked me to make a few remarks here, and I won't go on, and I saved you the torture of one of my PowerPoints. But when Katrina asked me to give a historical perspective, it was because kind of I was in the bowels of a lot of this for some time here. And the building blocks are, I think, a great opportunity for us to present to the world the programs that we already manage. And not only in mitigation, but in adaptation. And I'll make a couple of remarks there. But I think what Katrina, I think the way you put it is something like Cleaves, your history. And I just took that to mean, could you give a historical perspective? And so I hope you don't mind me kind of interpreting broadly what you told me. My wife told me to spend more time at the library after a few months of retirement. So I really appreciate being at this library here and seeing a lot of my old friends from inside the Forest Service and USDA, because you folks are the folks who hang in there. And I think if there's one thing that kind of typifies and exemplifies leadership in this climate change issue is a kind of impatient patience. I did a 40-year history, mainly for myself because nobody wanted to listen to it, of climate change in the Forest Service. And people say, well, what do you mean 40 years? Isn't that a very contemporary thing? It goes back 50 years that people in the Forest Service, but primarily the science division, were saying, we've got a changing climate going on here. We've got issues. Trees have carbon, imagine that. Let's start thinking about these kinds of things. And down through the ups and downs and the tension cycles that the agency and the department have been through, that patience in leadership has always ushered forth at the right times, as is now. So I think that what we do, and I know what we're facing now in this next phase are really 4 different sets of, you can call them challenges or you can call them opportunities. We've got an integration opportunity, integration of adaptation and mitigation. I don't think we can separate them. We have an integration opportunity in bringing carbon management or carbon emissions management into our existing programs and existing ways we think about things. We have a communication challenge and a communication opportunity. Who in the hell cares about carbon? Except us. Now, that's kind of facetiously presented, but it's very difficult with your clients. It's very difficult with people that you bump into at Starbucks to bring up the idea of carbon and emissions management. What are we actually talking about here? Not that it's irrelevant. It's just that there's a big distance between the way we think about emissions management, carbon sequestration, and others, and the way individuals who we want to persuade perceive it. I'm involved now with a group called the Forest Climate Working Group. It's a coalition of 25 different NGOs that organize around forest and climate and carbon issues. And one of the, and we pull our hair out actually in trying to communicate the really good information that comes out of USDA, the Forest Service, and other agencies in forms and narratives that people can actually understand and respond to. That's our big challenge. The third set of challenges, really organizational challenges. One historical perspective from the Forest Service and from kind of an insider's view, and now I have the advantage of being an outsider with the historical perspective of an insider, so I get to kind of see both sides of the two-way mirror here, is that our organizations are so stovepiped that regardless of what you bring into the arena, you have to break through the cell walls in any organization's stovepipes. And one of the big jobs that we had and still have in the Forest Service is taking something like emissions management or carbon sequestration or just carbon in general into all the multiple different dialects and cultures that exist in any one organization. We have cultures within cultures within cultures. Each one of those cultures is organized around a particular program. We got bug people, and we got fire people, and we got forest management people in the Forest Service, and each of them talk to one another quite well, but maybe not so much to other folks. So when you come up with an issue like climate change, carbon management that cuts across all of them, you have a big internal organization issue that takes energy. Sometimes we underestimate the energy it takes to break through our own stovepipes. And you can't just kind of flip a switch and everybody's going to talk about carbon, or everybody's going to take the building blocks and weave it into the National Forest System management, for example. It doesn't quite work that way. And it requires help. And then we have a political challenge. God, we have got political challenges both too. I had a friend of mine who was a fishing guide call me last night and he said, well, I wasn't able to reach you. I'm sure you're out in a Donald Trump campaign. You've practiced your boxing skills. And then he left that note and hung up. Okay. So, but I think in working with the Forest Climate Working Group, and I'm kind of the geek, I'm the guy with the glasses that they give questions to and say, go write me a term paper so I can actually go talk to real people about it. That's kind of my role. Okay. But the thing that they have to constantly attend to is the narrative. What is the story? Washington, D.C. in particular, inside the Beltway, is primarily an attention economy. There's a supply and a demand for attention. And to get attention, and to keep attention, and to keep the issue moving and relevant and salient enough so you can actually get something done with it is a real art. It's the art. And so we need, in the political sense, to give the messages, for example, the messages that come out of the building blocks. What are we actually trying to do with those? And put those in a crisp, clear form that has legs, that can actually travel. One of the neat things that just happened that the USDA came out with is that Bill Hohenstein's office, and I see Jan here and Joel and others, put together a set of projections on forest carbon that broke down the three sets of drivers into forest growth and mortality and the influence of things like climate change itself, land use change, which is not just a function of forest policy, but it's a function of ag policy and urban policy and everything else, and the harvested wood products piece. Whereas when we cut trees, we put them into wooden structures and they last even longer while we're growing more trees. So they broke those projections into those three parts, and those three parts then could become the bases for narratives. Always before it was just a projection with confidence intervals and error bands and all those statistical things that were very difficult to actually tell stories about. And I mean, true stories, not just make-up stories. So anyway, I think that as we move through today, and I'm literally looking forward to the discussions today, if we remember that we have this integration challenge and opportunity, at least in forestry, and I think in a lot of agriculture enterprises, adaptation is mitigation. I'm working down through some of the old literature, since I like to do old things now, on how much carbon do you get when you plant a tree? Isn't that a no-brainer? It ain't a no-brainer, because almost all of the literature that I've pulled out of how much carbon you get when you plant a tree did not look at the effects of climate change on the tree itself or the forest itself. How do you adjust that? How do we manage that? And so mitigation becomes adaptation, and then we got a communication challenge and certainly an organizational challenge. And I think the building blocks helps us develop a framework to organize around. And then lastly, the political challenge. So the Forest Climate Working Group that I work with is now thinking through what is the platform of advice we are going to give to an incoming administration, whoever they may be, that takes some of the concepts of the building blocks and says, this is what we think you could do. In forestry in particular, the future is in the behavior of the private landowners. The projections show that in the future, 80 to 90% of the carbon sequestration of the nation's forest, and that's about right now, about anywhere between 13 to 15% of the offset to the emissions, is in private hands, and it's in the East. So all the attention that given to the national forest lands in the West, there's some issues out there. 4 of those states are already a source, not a sink of carbon. But the real potential is in the East, and the real potential is on the 60 to 70% ownership on private lands. You're right in the middle of it. So thanks, folks. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave. That was great. Get a historical perspective. Dave, are you around all day today? Or do you? Right. Dave's here till noon today. So if you want to grab him during breaks, I think it's a great opportunity to get some historical perspective, some more details on that. As your MC, I know I won't be able to pick his brain too much, so please pass on what you learned from him to me as well. Our next speaker is Joel Larson. He is from the Climate Change Program Office in the Office of the Chief Economist, correct? Joel is going to talk to you about these famous building blocks that you might have been hearing about and that you all know about because you all did your reading before this meeting, right? Because this is a workshop. Having said that, we understand that maybe not everybody digested it all as well as they could have. And so Joel is going to remind us what the building blocks are and give us some background on how they came to be. Thanks, Joel.
So this can be the crib notes for folks who may have stayed up too late doing other things last night. Also, I feel like I should change my name to Dave after those last 2 presentations, so you can just call me Dave from now on. But thank you very much for having me here today. As Michelle mentioned, I work in the Climate Change Program Office at USDA. We're a small office that kind of tries to help coordinate climate-related policy and actions at the department and across agencies. And I will spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about the building blocks, which is really the framework for how we're proposing to help farmers respond to climate change and specifically to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sequestration. So when I say climate smart agriculture and forestry, what do I mean? Well, it's really built on 4 pillars. The first is that it promotes increases in agriculture and forestry productivity and farm and forest incomes. It also builds greater resilience to climate change. This is the adaptation component that we've been talking quite a bit about already today. It also reduces and removes greenhouse gas emissions and increases carbon sequestration. And the fourth piece is that it increases renewable energy production from farms and forest biomass. So as some background on the building blocks, they came about last year, just about a year and a half ago, actually, after President Obama announced that the US nationally was going to commit to a 26 to 28% reduction in its greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels by 2025. A lot of this was in the run-up to the Paris climate negotiations that just happened last December. And so based on that commitment, Secretary Vilsack came to the agencies and said, what can we do to support this goal through agriculture and forestry, and specifically through USDA's programs and authorities? The benefit of us doing this at USDA is that we're actually one of the only departments in the federal government that can both look at greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration. So we can reduce sources and we can also improve sinks. The goal also dovetails really well with a lot of what our agencies are already doing. Soil health initiative that NRCS has launched, a lot of the forest restoration work that our agencies are doing, the Forest Service is doing. Those sorts of things match and mesh well with this goal to reduce emissions and increase sequestration. So the agencies came back to the secretary and said, here are these 10 building blocks that we think we can focus on over the next 10 years, so between now and 2025. And on April 23rd of last year at Michigan State University, the secretary announced this framework. He announced not only the framework, but the goal of reducing emissions by 120 million metric tons by 2025. For comparison, that's the equivalent of taking about 25 million cars off the road for 1 year. If you look at it relative to the national goal, it's about 2%. So it's about, without forestry and agriculture, that goal would be about 24 to 26%. So as part of that event, a variety of partners also announced some early actions and commitments that they're making. Partnerships are going to be incredibly important in this effort. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that later on. But as I mentioned, this effort was part of the lead up to the climate negotiations, which is where the US formally committed to this 26 to 28% reduction. I'll get that right eventually. So these building blocks were not just kind of thrown out there ad hoc. We really wanted to make sure that they were established on a foundation of several principles. The first is that all of our actions are voluntary and incentive-based. USDA has a long history of cooperative conservation, working with partners through financial and technical assistance. We wanted to make sure that the building blocks continued that tradition. The second is we wanted to make sure that our actions were focused on policies, programs, and activities that have multiple economic and environmental benefits. So as you look across the broad suite of actions that we're taking, we're not only reducing emissions, we're also improving soil health, improving water quality, air quality, things along those lines. As the Department of Ag, we also have a mission to make sure that our actions increase and improve production of food and fiber. And so these building blocks are really focused primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on working lands and forests. And anything we do through this program needs to be measured so that we can evaluate our progress over time. You know, we can do all sorts of great things on the ground, but if we're not keeping track of that and if we're not able to tell the story, we're only doing half of the work. And then finally, and as I mentioned, all of our work is going to be cooperative and partnership based. So we're going to be working with our partners at the state level, with the private sector, and with nonprofit groups as well. So as Dave and Katrina mentioned, it is really hard to separate adaptation and mitigation, and there's really no need to. Any action that you take, or most actions that you can take related to mitigation in agriculture and forestry, also have an adaptation benefit. What we've found in kind of talking about this framework is that there are benefits to talking about both. For some folks, the primary driver for making a decision may be increasing the adaptability, the resilience of their farm operation, for example. That's their first priority. On the other hand, there may be a company or an organization that is really focused on reducing its greenhouse gas footprint. That's where we can start the conversation by talking about mitigation. So it's important to talk about those two. It's really impossible to kind of break them apart. And so as we have conversations over the next couple of days and we talk about how we can start implementing these programs on the ground, I think it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about what that entry point can be. So what were the building blocks themselves and how were they developed? After the secretary asked the agencies to look into this issue, they brought these 10 building blocks back to him. Teams made up of representatives from the USDA agencies looked at the relevant programs and authorities that we have under the Farm Bill, the technologies and practices that could be used to achieve the goals, metrics that we can use to measure progress, co-benefits of these actions, getting back to things like water quality improvements, and any barriers, constraints, and trade-offs that would be needed, should be considered as we move forward. So the building blocks themselves all have specific and quantitative goals that they're working towards. So the first, soil health, aims to promote conservation practices that improve soil organic matter, reduce emissions from soils and equipment, and promote healthier soils nationwide. Nitrogen stewardship focuses on the effective use of nitrogen fertilizer through the 4 R's. Livestock partnerships looks at reducing methane emissions from animals and primarily from manure management with dairy cattle and swine. We're looking at ways that we can do that through the increased use and installation of digesters, as well as impermeable covers for lagoons and things like that, so that we're trapping the methane, or we're trapping and flaring the methane so that it's not just being released into the atmosphere. Conservation of sensitive lands aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from marginal croplands and lands that have high carbon sequestration potential. In particular, we're looking at the Conservation Reserve Program as a big part of this, also ASEP, and various other private easement programs. This is going to be an interesting one in terms of partnerships as well. We've already had some examples where groups have come to us and said, or come to USDA or come to NRCS and said, we want to transition an expiring CRP contract to a private easement. The benefit of doing something like that is that because we have statutory limits on how much land we can enroll in CRP, we transition that expiring contract to private easement. We can pull that acreage back and use that for new enrollment. So this is one where private sector involvement from the nonprofit groups can be particularly important. Focus on grazing and pasture lands really aims to reduce emissions by establishing grazing management plans. And there are several building blocks that focus on forestry. So we're promoting private forest growth and retention. As Dave mentioned, that's a huge opportunity for us, particularly in the eastern US. In the western US, we're looking at ways in which federal forest management can help improve sequestration, or in some cases, reduce the loss of carbon. And then we're also looking at how to improve or increase the use of wood products, particularly in commercial buildings, and increase urban tree planting. And finally, and this is a big building block, we're looking at energy generation and efficiency. This is looking at authorities programs with RD, with NRCS, Rural Housing Service, RUS, and RBS as well. One thing to note, and that we've been trying to reiterate about these building blocks, is they're neither exclusive nor are they comprehensive. They're not static. And we've already gone through the process of looking at how we can incorporate some new principles, some new actions into this. I know one of the sessions today is going to be talking about agroforestry. That's one that we're looking at specifically, but we're also looking at things like rice production and ways that we can reduce emissions from that sector. So as we go along over the next 10 years, we're not planning to stick absolutely with all of these 10, but it's meant to more be a living framework, something that we can address over the period of time. So as I mentioned, these building blocks aren't limited to direct USDA action, and a key component is the work that we're doing with partners and the work that we will be doing with partners. There are a variety of private companies, industry groups, and NGOs that are interested in these issues and can really help move beyond what USDA can do directly. At the April announcement last year, several groups came out with additional actions that they plan to take. For example, the Fertilizer Institute pledged about $6 million to help improve nutrient stewardship and nutrient use efficiency. Likewise, a group that included Walmart, United Suppliers, and the Environmental Defense Fund committed to enrolling about 10 million acres in United Suppliers' SUSTAIN program with the goal of improving nutrient management on those lands. Since the April announcement, you've also seen other companies that have come out with similar goals. Monsanto has announced last fall that they plan to have their operations be carbon neutral by 2021. That's through both operational changes, so increasing the efficiency of their plants, for example, but they're also looking at offsetting some of those emissions through practices that we're talking about with these building blocks. Similarly, on the forestry side, groups like the Trust for Public Land, the folks that Dave's working with now, they're developing toolkits, guidance to help forest landowners and forest managers improve carbon sequestration on their operations. So the next steps for these building blocks are developing implementation plans that'll guide their actions over the next couple of years. Like Dave mentioned, a big part of our challenge is going to be breaking down those silos, those, as a former boss of mine said, cylinders of excellence that we work in. We want to make sure that we can start that conversation, and one of the ways that we're doing that is getting these groups that initially came up with the building blocks to continue to work together so we can leverage programs that NRCS has with those that Forest Service has, those that all of the agencies have to take advantage of their particular audiences, authorities, and funding. The plans will lay out a path over the next 3 years, and they'll include a variety of actions that agencies can take. So these will be direct actions, so improving the use of nutrient stewardship, nutrient management plans through NRCS's EQIP program that we can measure the greenhouse gas benefit from. But we also understand that there is some foundational work that needs to be done. So some of the other actions are policy and guidance for how to incorporate these building blocks, how to incorporate the concept of carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas reduction into the way that our agencies make decisions. We're also looking at actions we can take for outreach and training. Workshops like this are going to be incredibly important. We want to make sure that we can continue that over the next few years to get the message out. And then we're also highlighting opportunities for partnership. We've had groups that have come to our agencies, come to our office and say, what can we do to help? There's a huge appetite for this right now, and we want to make sure that we're well positioned to respond to that. Another piece of work that we're going to be doing, and that several folks in this room have already contributed to, is monitoring progress. So establishing metrics to not only tell the good work that our agencies and our offices and staff are doing right now, but over the next 10 years, kind of improve that. There are two parts to this. One is practice and what we call practice and technology data. So this is measuring the amount of permanent no-till that's being adopted across the country, or counting the number of lagoon covers with flares that are out there. This is something that we're going to need to know to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and forestry. We also know that because we're not doing all of this directly, we're going to have to find a way to measure the work that our partners are doing. So A few of us were just at a meeting yesterday that was hosted by the Fertilizer Institute, and we were talking about how to track this issue, how to track nutrient management plans that certified crop advisors work on when they're out in the field. That's not something that USDA does, but it has the same effect as our NRCS staff going out there and doing that work as well. So are there ways that we can start to record that information in a way that helps show the progress that we're going to be making? So over the next 2 days, we hope that this workshop can continue the discussion about what these building blocks mean at the regional level. We know that what works in the Northeast, the ag and forest profile in this region is very different than in the Southwest. And so the building blocks are going to have a different emphasis here than they are elsewhere. And we really hope that this conversation about what these building blocks mean here in the Northeast and even within different parts of the region, we want to get that conversation started today. So I think I can wrap up there, take any questions that folks have. I'm happy to answer anything now or over the next couple of days.
Thank you. Great presentation. Recently, when the Prime Minister of Canada was here, he and President Obama agreed to reduce methane emissions by, I believe, 40 to 45% from 2012 levels by 2025. And I was just wondering how that factors into the goal that you mentioned.
So the livestock partnerships building block is a major part of that. That's looking at reducing methane emissions primarily from manure management. A big portion of agriculture's methane emissions profile is also from enteric fermentation. And that's been a tough nut to crack. There is some work that's been done on things like diet, breeding to reduce those enteric emissions. And what's interesting is that we're learning a lot from what folks are doing internationally. So New Zealand has a significant livestock industry, and because of that, those methane emissions are a big part of their emissions profile, and a big part of their commitment to reduce emissions is based on improving emissions from enteric fermentation. For us, initially, we wanted to look at the manure management portion of that, but one of the things that we're also doing with the building blocks is trying to figure out a way that we can set some research priorities. And so the enteric fermentation piece is going to be a big part of that, ways in which we can improve or reduce emissions from enteric fermentation.
Thank you. In terms of metrics, is there any effort to track some of the kind of national and global public perception trends that are impacting agriculture and that potentially have a impact on emissions, like things like consumer concerns about GMO and potential impacts on, how producers grow crops and conservation tillage acres? RBGH is another one, and so and I'm thinking of what's it called? Anyways, there's these kind of consumer perceptions that are potentially having big impacts on agriculture and climate change. Is USDA tracking that at all?
Not that
specifically related to those kind of trends.
Mm-hmm. Not that I know of. I mean, in terms of going out and actually doing those kind of surveys. My background is in social and economic analysis, and so that's particularly interesting to me. But we know that issue is out there. And so folks are coming to retailers and saying, we want to know what the environmental footprint of these products are, and we want to be informed about it. I mean, you see it related to GMOs as well. The challenge there is how do you provide information in a way that also accurately reflects the impacts of that decision making. And so what we're looking at right now is starting to talk with farmers and producers and forest landowners so they're aware of the issues. And when a purchaser comes to them and says, we want to know what the greenhouse gas footprint of your operation is, they can have the tools to respond to that. And in terms of, are we tracking kind of consumer attitudes towards these kind of products? That I don't really know, but it would be a great question for follow-up. The other folks in the room may know more about that than, well, I'm sure they know more about that than I do.
Good morning and thank you. Quick question. It seems like your policy is following sort of the traditional model of the federal government providing grants and other incentives for the ag community. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to whether or not you're sort of thinking in the back of your minds in a parallel path in terms of for those producers that don't use your incentive programs, whether there's the whole notion of offsets and where that might fit into the Clean Power Plan, and how some of the states in the Northeast do allow for offsets. And so there would be sort of this conflict unless it's running along a parallel path.
So yes, we are looking at those, and that's part of why we want to keep the building blocks as an open framework. The initial task was what are our existing authorities and what can we do under USDA programs right now, understanding that over the course of this 10 years, we're going to likely see at least one, if not two, farm bills. And also that we've seen over the last several years, there's been some challenges in getting new programs and authorities off the ground and get the legislation moving to do that sort of thing. We have been working with EPA as they've been crafting the Clean Power Plan to try and encourage as much as we can the concept of offsets or incorporating sustainable biomass into the way that states are crafting their plan. And so we've been having those conversations, and we absolutely want to continue to keep doing that. And then I guess in the lack of a formal kind of national cap and trade program, we kind of have to start looking for different policy levers and different incentives that we can use. But states like California are very interested in what we're doing with the building blocks. Their cap and trade program doesn't cover agriculture and forestry and land use. And I don't think there are any plans to have them do that. But they are looking at ways in which they can take some of the revenue that's generated through that program and encourage these sorts of conservation practices, these sorts of greenhouse gas practices in agriculture and forestry as well.
I think we have time for one more question, as long as the answer is short.
I'll try. I have no guarantees.
No, that's not a criticism at all, Joel, just that we have limited time. Any other questions?
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thanks so much.
So if any of you guys have seen an agenda, could you let me know what it is? And that'd be great. But no, seriously, we just have an updated agenda that is, if you don't have one, there's one at the registration table. We want to take 5 more minutes before we go on our official break, which is scheduled at 10:10. So again, one more time, I want to talk about what are some of our main rooms. Today we have this main room. This is what is called the main room. We will be coming in and out of this room throughout the day. So any group sessions, lunch, and also you might notice some panels on the back side. We're going to be having some Post-its and discussions and opportunities will be all along this throughout the 2 days. This is time for you to have a self-guided comments and discussions. We'll talk about that a little bit later, what that's going to look like. But when you don't have an opportunity to be in a session that you want to be in, and if you look at the agenda, there's a lot of topics missing that we need to talk about, that you might have thoughts or concerns or opportunities that you think you want to give comments, feel free to put them on those boards. There's Post-it pads around, give your thoughts, or commit a colleague to talking about it. It's up to you. Feel free. So take advantage of that. The next part is, so that's the main room. Another room that's of note for our breakout sessions is room 107. That is directly behind the registration table, and it's right here. So that will be one breakout session room. The next one is the 14th floor. If you want to get there, you need to know somebody with a badge. So we will be escorting you for USDA folks for the 14th floor. And on the 14th floor, there are two opportunities to do things. You can do the workshop, yay, or, and this is very important for panelists, speakers, and people who have innovative thoughts and ideas, which means almost everybody here, but definitely for panelists. Up on the 14th floor, there is an opportunity to leave video messaging. This is what we're going to use to supplement some of our virtual sessions and learning modules. This will, brief video messaging, 5 minutes or less. And the person who will be working with that is Kara. Kara, could you please stand up for us? Thank you. She'll be there the whole time for when you have an off session, breaks, lunches. She doesn't get to eat. So she's there for when you guys want to talk. The next thing that you guys should know about is that if you're missing reading materials, we made some copies of things. There's a couple copies of reading materials for session breakouts that will be at the table, registration table. We'll also bring them up to the independent sessions. And if people have general handouts that they want to give about different areas and topics of what they're doing, there'll be some on the back table back there for reading. So during your session, let's talk about just a few rules. Time's going to go fast. Really fast. The panelist discussions are going to be approximately 20 minutes to a half hour. That leaves us 1 hour to talk about a lot of things. So please make sure that you realize this is just the beginning of the conversation. So if we start getting stuck around the axle, allow it to happen, state the concern. But if you're not able to state every concern you want or have an issue, there will be post-it pads. So we will be able to have opportunities to talk with you later on about those issues or put them up here if you didn't have a voice. Also, in your off times and sessions when you guys talk with each other, I know you guys are going to have great ideas. Please be sure to capture them, at least 2 or 3 thoughts at the very end, and share them with us. I think most of you guys are going to really enjoy the break time to get to know each other and have great thoughts, but please don't let them just walk out the door with yourselves. Please try to find a way to convey them. When you're in the breakout sessions in the work group, there's another rule that I would like to talk with you guys about. We like to make sure that this is a safe conversation. So what you say is pretty much going to be kept in that room. If you're not a USDA employee and you guys are invited guests here, please take what you hear as an opportunity for us to be thinking and brainstorming and creating, and not something that we're going to be committed to, for the rest of our lives and go forward. So that's just something, I know it sounds a little odd, but just, this is a time for us just to think and create. So the last thing is, whenever you have an agenda, you need to correct it. So we currently have a break that says it's going to go to 10:40, but actually our workshop sessions begin at 10:25. We have 15 minutes after this. We have coffee in the back, lunch is at 12. There are restrooms on this floor and up there. So for you guys to know, next thing that you have to do is where are you going to be? So if you are in soil health and nitrogen stewardship management, you are in this main area. Please stay here. If you are in grazing and pasture lands, you're actually going to be right around this corner. If you're in energy generation and efficiency and livestock partnership, you will be upstairs on the 14th floor. Please try to get there about 2 or 3 minutes in advance. You guys will be waxing and waning throughout the rooms throughout the day, so please carry your stuff with you. And that's it. Have a great day.
Shows up and say it's like, okay, we're on. But we have to turn Hello, breakers. It is time to start moving to your breakout rooms. Please begin to move towards your rooms. Please begin to relocate to your chosen breakout session. If you are in this room, you are here for soil health and nitrogen stewardship. If that is not your track, please move to your designated areas.
Hello. Can you guys hear me? Hey, everybody. Guess what? It's time to stop talking so we can talk some more. Ding, ding, ding. 10:30. If you are in this room and you are not in the soil health and nitrogen stewardship track session, please raise your hand. You are in it. Stop that. Is everybody here for the soil health and nitrogen stewardship session? If you're not here for that session, you're welcome to stay. We'll take you. But if you do not want to be here, now's the time to leave. Oh, let's do that. That sounds great. This is a big enough group. Thank you all for coming. This is a big enough group. I was initially going to pass around the microphone so everybody could say who they are, but that would take up all our time. So we're not doing that. Instead, Megan here is going to pass around a sign-up sheet. I'm going to introduce Megan right now because I don't think she has been yet, a University of Maryland graduate student who's been critical in making this thing happen in a very timely fashion. So go ahead and pass that around, and thank you. Thanks for clapping too, I should have. As you all know, my name is Michelle Cavagelli and I'm the MC. Okay, that joke is old. I just want to give a quick introduction before we have our 4 panelists give short presentation to describe what we're trying to do here and what your role as participants and or panelists is. We have an hour and a half until noon, and lunch will be here too, by the way, so you don't even need to move for that. You guys are lucked out. What we're trying to accomplish is have a conversation. We're trying to have a conversation about what are the challenges to greenhouse gas mitigation. You heard this morning about the importance of greenhouse gas mitigation, the role that agriculture can play in doing that, but there's some challenges. There's lots of challenges. You guys probably know them a lot better than I do. I like doing research on greenhouse gases, but going from the research to the implementation is a completely different issue, as you all know. And so I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy you guys are all here because I'm on a steep learning curve here to learn what are you guys going to do with our research. And my role today is to facilitate, and that's all I'm doing. We have a couple of important people that I need to introduce you to who are also playing a background role here. And one of them is nodding her head, don't introduce me, but I'm going to anyway. This is Victoria Ackroyd, a postdoc with Stephen Mirsky, our first speaker. She'll be taking notes. You all are going to be recorded during your panel presentation. And then during the discussion, we are going to record that. So I'll be the guy bringing the microphone around. I'll also be the guy with some planted questions in case we need to get the discussion moving. So don't bother Victoria. She needs to work. Also, I want to introduce you to Eric Hoffman on the left here. Eric is also a graduate student he's a graduate student at University of Maryland like Megan. He'll be finishing his master's in May. He's also been critical in pulling together a lot of the background information for this workshop. And he will be starting a USDA position in June, I believe, at the office of something with the name budget in it. So be nice to him. We're really fortunate to have these three people helping us out today. And I think that's all I need to say now. I'm going to now introduce Stephen Mirsky. Come on up, Stephen. Who's going to give a talk. We are talking in this group about 2 of the 10 building blocks. We're talking about soil health, and we're talking about nitrogen stewardship. If you remember from Joel's presentation, the first 2 building blocks, the 2 most important ones, of course. Stephen's going to talk a little bit about the soil health building block. We're not covering all aspects of the building blocks in these panel presentations. The goal is to throw some ideas out to help you think, get your minds moving in a direction. A topic that is not part of the panel talks is certainly an option for discussion if it fits those 2 building blocks. So don't let the panel talks constrain you, but let them provide an opening. With that, Stephen Mirsky, an ecologist at Agricultural Research Service right across the street, and one of my close colleagues. Happy to have him here, and a cover crop expert. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Michelle. Make sure this is working here, right? Yep. Oops. All right, this is great. I'm looking forward to giving a talk where I don't have to describe all the great things that cover crops do. Michelle told me that everybody here has already decided that cover crops are great, so I don't need that. I don't need that introduction. So wonderful. And I did put, to probably Michelle's chagrin, I put nitrogen management in the title because I know that that's a separate topic, and we're talking about cover crops for soil health, but certainly cover crops play a key role in nitrogen management as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mainly the challenges of getting cover crops adopted and some promising things that are coming, at least in the Northeast, as it relates to the Climate Hub. So for the soil health building block, these are certainly a number of strategies to improve soil health. Cover crops are one of these themes, although cover crops are multifunctional tools, right? They do a lot of different things. So they really tie and link to even a lot of these other types of strategies for building soil health. So here's a depiction of some of the challenges that I think there are out there for cover crop adoption. I work with a lot of groups all over the country, researchers, ag professionals, and farmers, and these seem to be the main themes that underscore the challenge. And I put in here beyond cost because certainly for many producers, it's just the cost that is the limiting step for them. But when we move beyond just the cost, the major constraints to cover crop adoption, this is one of the biggest, is establishment. The germplasm we have, both the availability and the quality of that germplasm. And then down here, this is a little figure that Michelle and I put together that represents the Farming Systems Project and shows variability in cover crop performance between two of the systems. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about just cover crops variability in its actual performance and the management challenges. And then the last being lack of information, or misinformation is what I would call that. So it's pretty clear that one of the biggest limiting factors to cover crop adoption is establishment timing, particularly as we move further north. But I think it's not accurate to just depict this as a northern thing. Even the southern locations, folks tend to fill their growing season with the maturity groups of the crops that fit their growing season. And so planting date in the fall is a challenge for most producers in general. And if you look at these, and I'm sorry for the small text, these surveys, these are both national surveys. I was a part of this one. This is one that was done by North Central SARE. Rob Myers, I think, led this effort. And clearly at the top of these constantly come down to establishment timing. You know, to be able to either the too wet conditions, getting the cover crop established, or it's too cold and so the cover crop doesn't perform. So getting the cover crops into the system is key. And I'm thinking that there's a lot of progress thus far there on this issue. So there are the early innovators. For example, we're working here with the folks up at Penn State and at Cornell, who this is kind of the Penn State interseeder. It's a three-way interseeder, and it can interseed cover crops into existing cash crops. And this is what it looks like here in this bottom left panel, as far as cover crop seeds interseeded into a living corn crop. So this interseeder technology is coming on, but I would say that ag engineers need to become a big part of cover crops and cover crop establishment. And so I'm glad that there's some early innovators, but this is really a key issue that we need to address. And you'll see more and more equipment companies coming online. There has been a lot of regional species testing, so which would work better. That's something that is, we're getting more information across the region. And lastly, I think that one of the things that we need to see happening is seed coat technology being developed. You know, there's a number of reasons why we would want to coat cover crop seeds and how that would aid in establishment. There is a seed scientist up at Cornell who's starting to work on this. So there is some efforts in the Northeast, but this is a big part of the need to get cover crops established. Breeding. We need to start breeding cover crops. This is a low-hanging fruit. There's very little improvements that's been done on cover crops. Certainly folks who are forage breeders like to consider cover crops as part of, you know, the product that they're developing and the multifunctional role of forages. But we can think of many examples where breeding for forage quality is not going to serve our benefits with what services we're targeting with cover crops. We don't always want our cover crops to be very digestible. In fact, we sometimes like our cover crops to sit around on the soil surface and not be very digestible for long periods of time. So these are just a laundry list of some of the key traits that we hear from producers that they're interested in. And since there's been very little improvement thus far, this is a low-hanging fruit to start to see rapid improvement in the short term. Not lastly, but variability in performance. You know, cover crops are plants. they're like everything we put out in the field. They require a lot of management, and historically the level of attention to cover crops and how much care is put into establishment and management, and all of the other factors that we put into our cash crop management, that same level of attention needs to be put into our covers. There's certainly a lot of research going into all these different aspects of cover crop management, and so that's coming online, but this has been very slow to get going, and so there's not a lot of regional specific information about management to optimize its performance. Lastly was the misinformation or the need for more information. So there's starting to become more information online, certainly, but we need central clearinghouses for this, platforms where folks can interact and network and learn more about cover crops. So at least I'm pleased to say that this year there will be the formation of the Northeast Cover Crop Council. It'll be somewhat modeled after the Midwest Cover Crop Council. It'll have some unique features to it, but the first meeting will be at the end of the month, so next week. And this will be a resource for the Northeast from years to come, where folks can interact, researchers, ag professionals, farmers, where they can discuss the cover crops management, define knowledge gaps, and then the researchers can go and address those knowledge gaps. So anyway, a little bit of the constraints and some promise that's coming. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. That was great. Stephen set a good example for our panelists. Throw out a lot of quick information. Go sit down. We are going to have the 4 panelists speaking up here first and then have conversation. I might not have made that clear. Also, I just want to point out real quickly that we have some handouts in case you didn't pick them up and in case you didn't read them before you came here. Plus, we modified them just to make them more interesting just last night. I'll leave these down on this blue table where no one's sitting if anybody wants to pick one up before the conversation. And now I'm going to introduce the next speaker. That is Doug Lawrence. I'm really happy to have him here. I didn't know him before this conference, but one of our key collaborators up in Vermont from NRCS, Lynn Knight, who was a critical in getting this operation going, introduced Doug and asked him to join us. Doug is an economist, now with Blackwoods Group, but has spent a career in NRCS. All NRCS? I can't remember. Feel free to add any details, and please feel free to come on up. He's going to talk about a number of initiatives between the private and public sector to address greenhouse gas mitigation, and I think I'll leave it at that. Is that good enough? Thanks, Doug. Thank you.
Let's see one and down. Yep. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you for coming to hear me speak today. What I'm going to do is a bit different. It's not science-based in the sense, it's not physical science-based. It's more closely aligned with the mother of all sciences, economics, and behavioral sciences. One of the things that's part of the existing building blocks are partners, and I think that's really critical. I listed a few here that I'm sure the Fertilizer Institute is one of the partners. Is that right? Did I get that right? I think so, yeah. I've been working with the Soil Renaissance Initiative. It's about 1.5 years, 2 years old. Something that came from the partnership of the Farm Foundation and the Noble Foundation. And from that spun off the Soil Health Institute, and NRCS's very own Wayne Honeycutt is the new director of that institute, which is going to be located in North Carolina in the Research Triangle. One of the interesting things about it, as far as researchers go, is that Noble has endowed them with about $20 million that they'll dole out over the next 10 years for research. And they're looking for additional donations from the donor world. So this is a big deal. So they'll be able to help fill in the gaps associated with soil health and soil science. There's also the 4 Rs. I won't go into that. I worked a bit with the Fertilizer Institute on some of this stuff, and I think they've had great success. Are people aware of the 4 Rs? it penetrated pretty well, I think, into the production as well as the scientific and government communities. There's also conservation financing, which is something that takes, a step and a half forward and a step and a half back and 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. Seems to lack traction. A lot of that comes from, I think as an economist, it'll be generated through pretty strong regulations, and we're still waiting for that. So that's an unknown, but that would be another area that would help in implementation. As far as the private sector, I think one thing I'd like to focus on is precision agriculture. It's something that my experience in NRCS, although there are many aspects of precision agriculture that have a conservation benefit. Norm, is that true? Yes. I don't think the NRCS, I'm not sure about the larger part of USDA, has done a lot. I mean, it has really beat the drums for precision agriculture, and there's probably a lot more that can be done there. I was reading an investment article that indicated that globally $2.8 billion was earned in terms of revenue from precision agriculture companies around the world. And in the next 8 years, that'll go up to $6.4 billion. It's a growth rate of 12% a year or so. So that's really, things are happening. There are all kinds of new things, sensors. It's the internet of agriculture is upon us. One fellow, I was at a meeting yesterday, and this guy had one of his staff keeping track of the new precision agriculture companies popping up, and it became a full-time job. It is that amazing, and of course there are big players like John Deere and others, Raven. So that's one thing I'd like to emphasize in that area. And then there's the universities and data organizations. Many of these things you're probably well aware of, and the list goes on and on. I guess the big thing here is this Midwest Cover Crops Council. They're forming a Northeast Cover Crops Council. Are you guys aware of that? I guess it's happening now, but should be a big help in moving cover crops in an area where they're probably pretty tough, given the climate and so forth, and the nature of New England farmers. Then I thought I'd mention, and these things you're probably also aware of, but there are a lot of technical resources. NRCS is doing 2 things that will be of great benefit, I think, and one is the National Soil Health Assessment that's being led by Bianca Moevis-Clune. And then there's the National Soil Carbon Assessment, which is done, and they're recalibrating that as we speak and should have a report out shortly. They did publish some things, but I think there was some concern about some of the results. Then the farmer surveys all over the place that can help identify barriers and opportunities. And economics is always among the top things in terms of adopting conservation. Then at the farm level, there's right now there's a data gap in taking the conservation practice and then its effect on the soil, and then that effect on yield and yield variability. And one way of maybe leapfrogging over that gap as it gets filled is something like APEX, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is a plant growth model that was developed by ARS at the Blacklands Center in Temple, Texas. There are a number of decision support tools that are popping up, and one of them is the Resource Stewardship Evaluation Tool. And Chris gave me the most recent printout of a summary of it, and this could be a real bonus, especially if you can, maybe in the sense of soil health and greenhouse gas sequestration, carbon sequestration, if you could plan to see something like that rather than, having that as a goal, or at least providing the farmer with a plan that optimizes greenhouse gas reduction or mitigation. And lastly, the Soil Renaissance Initiative that I spoke about before has a group that's investigating measurement of soil health. And Norm, I think you're on that group. No. Okay, is there anyone on that group? No, okay, so I can say anything and you won't. One of the big challenges there is it costs about $100 to do a Cornell soil health test, something like that. And that's just not commercially viable. And so one of their tasks is to come up with consensus on simpler, cheaper ways of measuring soil health. And I guess that if you get a room full of, if you want to start a bar fight, I guess, with a bunch of agronomists, talk about simplifying soil health measurement. And then as far as policy options, something that looking broader than just, USDA, there is a task force, conservation and crop insurance task force that the Agree outfit has going, and they're trying to use crop insurance as an incentive to adopt soil health practices. And it's very difficult. The soil health world is I think moving forward, but the crop insurance world is loath to change. I mean, things are okay now. Let's not change anything. And so it'll be interesting to see where that lands. Again, as I mentioned, the Farm Bill is coming up. And it looks like 2008 or so. And there may be a lot of opportunities. It looks like, from what I hear, that this could be a tough year for conservation. Conservation has had many very, very good years, or good farm bills. This one could be a bit tougher. And so all these programs, I guess one way of helping that is providing information to the policymakers about the benefits of these programs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's the conservation districts and making sure that they have as a priority greenhouse gas reduction. A lot of times, I think across the country, that probably doesn't rise very high in their list of priorities. And then again, as I mentioned, the resource stewardship tool, I think there's an opportunity there to get consistent planning across the US by NRCS and conservation districts associated with reducing greenhouse gases. And then finally, one of the big issues I found in working at USDA was getting any of the markets that have popped up don't really smile on agricultural offsets. I mean, the uncertainty and variability is so great. The discount is so enormous that you end up not getting paid much. And so overcoming that, I think would be a great challenge. And one thing, maybe there's a way to use crop insurance to somehow guarantee the offsets in some sense. Maybe there's some risk reduction possibility in that world. And then finally, a few questions. And I think one big challenge for USDA, because it's government, is extending partnerships to individual firms. It's really difficult because other firms may get upset, sue, and so forth. But it'd be interesting to be able to find a way of doing that. So I think a lot is going on in industry, especially with respect to precision agriculture, and it would be great to enhance that partnership. I think that, let's see, one big issue in the Northeast is alternatives to no-till. Is that fair? And whether it's rotations or equipment, new equipment, whatever it might be. And then there's the economies of scale barrier in the Northeast. Small farms, small fields, it's difficult to do the same, apply the technology from the Midwest and Great Plains to this area. In fact, I remember working with in New York, a farm that was getting a comprehensive nutrient management plan done. It may have had 100 fields. I mean, it was really expensive to get this thing sorted out. And then lastly, I noted that I guess USDA needs to put some perspective or context on where the biggest bang for the buck is. Is it in methane, or is it in the nitrous oxide, or is it in carbon sequestration in the soil? Or Dave, is it trees, or all of the above? To help farmers make decisions. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Doug. This is great. This is we have more than enough to talk about for an hour and a half right there, right? So maybe we'll just leave this up and get to the discussion. Just kidding. Our next speaker is Chris Gross, who is a conservation agronomist, nutrient management specialist with USDA NRCS. He's been there since 1989. He's served in various roles of field offices, state offices, and he's now at the national level. I understand that he's also a University of Maryland graduate. Yeah, well, we try not to, but come on up. One thing I have not mentioned is that this workshop is a joint effort between University of Maryland and USDA ALS in Beltsville. Hence, that's why we have these wonderful University of Maryland students here. So I won't badmouth University of Maryland. Okay. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Michelle. Is there a clicker or are we just using the arrow button? Okay. Thanks, everybody. And I welcome everybody to our Northeast Climate Hub Greenhouse Mitigation Workshop. Look forward to a lot of great discussion today. I just want to recap just a few things that were said already today, just to kind of set the stage when we talk about climate smart agriculture. Designed to assist farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners in responding to climate change. The framework consists of the 10 building blocks that span a range of technologies and practices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase carbon storage, and generate clean renewable energy. Doug, I don't know if that's already getting at your question, but I mean, it's already pretty broad to begin with. So I'm not sure that we can focus down and be very broad all at the same time, but that's part of our challenge. The building blocks are all voluntary, obviously incentive-based for it to work, focused on multiple economic and environmental benefits, and most of all, intended to meet the needs of the producers. If the producers aren't going to adopt them, then we're wasting our time. I mean, I think we've seen that time and time again with activities, things that have been initiated that just don't go anywhere. So the fact that we're very cognizant of the fact right up front that it's got to meet the needs of the producers says a whole lot. Cooperative and focused on building partnerships. I think everybody realizes that without putting all the heads together, we're not going to get where we need to. So we need to be doing that. And then measurable so that there can be outcomes and also funding coming along to get this going. The 10 building blocks, as have been mentioned already, I'm only going to focus the rest of my presentation on the nitrogen stewardship one. That was my task for the few minutes that I have. And nitrogen stewardship is led by NRCS, this is the USDA agency, but includes ARS and NIFA as well. Excuse me. The building block aims to reduce N2O emissions by 7 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent by the year 2025. That may not sound like such a tough task, but in order to do that, we would need to be enrolling and maintaining approximately 64 million acres of cropland under nutrient management designed to mitigate N2O emissions. That's a pretty big number. These N2O emissions from crop nitrogen management do depend on a number of factors. And it's already been mentioned, the 4R concept, which industry and NRCS and everyone pretty much has jumped on this bandwagon. The right form, the right time, the right placement, and the right rate. So we keep working toward that. The mantra here with the nitrogen stewardship, obviously the emission of greenhouse gases on crop and pasture land can be reduced substantially, both through improved nitrogen management practices and therefore also through increased nitrogen use efficiency. The weather and the soil health influence losses to the environment, resulting in nitrogen use efficiency as well. We can't really talk about nitrogen stewardship and not talk about soil health. I mean, they do go hand in hand. So when we talk about soil health, obviously the management of the cropping system, cropping rotation, we'd like to see some minimum or minimize the tillage activities there. Managing live and dead residue cover. Stephen Mirsky talked about cover crops as well. All of this promotes nutrient cycling and adds resilience to the soil and to the farm as well. So the enhanced nutrient management, we talked about the 4 R's, but there's greater benefits, not only from an N2O emission side, but we also have the potential when we're doing nutrient management and talking about enhanced nutrient management to reduce nutrient losses in runoff leaching, resulting in improved water quality overall. So it's not only an air quality activity, there's also a water quality component to this as well. The improved nutrient use efficiency and the like is also a win-win for the producer. Reducing the nitrogen inputs by better management, by better timing, better placement, all gets to the bottom line for the producer. So it's a win-win situation. And we also, as part of the nitrogen stewardship, talk about wanting and being able to maintain 75% of these acres that are fall under nitrogen stewardship would also remain. I mean, obviously, they're not going to be acres that you would plan one time and then never plan again. But we're also realistic that not every acre that gets planned in 2016 will be in still under nutrient management in 2025. So the goal is not just to manage nitrogen, but it's to manage all nutrients and all nutrient sources. And again, one of the cornerstones is these 4 R's of nutrient management. So how do we accomplish this task of reducing the N2O emissions? We'll need to prioritize nutrient management efforts in certain areas. We'll need to secure some additional funding for the technical assistance. The plan right now is 5 million acres of nutrient management each year between the years 2016 and 2025 for a total of 50 million acres. So if you roughly use $12.50 an acre, is that a good number, Trish? Okay. That comes to $62.5 million per year to try to do that. So, I mean, there's a lot involved in getting us there. Obviously, we'll need to work on recruiting and training additional TSPs that are going to provide direct technical assistance to the producers. We can work through our systems, through the CAPS, as part of the programs to get nutrient management on the ground, but really developing partnerships with agronomic consultants and agribusinesses are key, and then also acquiring additional funding for TSPs and the like to get the work done and on the ground. Through NRCS, the options, of course, EQIP funds, I mentioned the CAPS, contracting directly with private sector consultants, NRCS doing the nutrient management plans through what we have is the 590 nutrient management practice code. But that's going to be a challenge to accomplish the goal and to meet that entire need. So that's why we need to have this discussion. Another avenue, as Doug mentioned, the resource stewardship activity, resource stewardship evaluation, or resource stewardship evaluation tool, will work with producers to try to get to a stewardship level of conservation where we're looking at nutrient management, pest management, conservation planning, and a host of other things, wildlife, forestry activities, and the like, and protect natural resources. So that's a new activity that's gaining momentum right now. Our chief is real excited and interested with that, and we're looking to pursue that further as an option and activity. The agribusiness sector, like I said, working with other companies, cooperatives, independent consultants, is going to be key. There was just a meeting yesterday, and when we get into this discussion, I'm hoping Norm Widman, our national agronomist, will share some of the information. Meeting with TFI yesterday to try to see how and where we can go to develop this and where the opportunities lie to then report these acres that are being developed. I mean, it's one thing to have them, and we know there's lots of acres out there, but we, in many cases, have a hard time trying to accumulate those acres to see where they are and how many acres are actually under nutrient management. We talked about the win-win. So as part of our discussion today, I'm hoping we can talk about how we're going to get the 7 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent accomplished and getting those 64 million acres under nutrient management. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That was wonderful. It becomes apparent to me as we're hearing the panelists that this could be a 2-day meeting on just this topic. So we're not going to get all the answers, but we certainly are accumulating questions, so I appreciate that. We have one last panelist. Trish Steinhilber is Nutrient Management Specialist at University of Maryland, and I'm really happy to have her to provide, so we can go from this kind of national level that Chris provided to kind of a boots on the ground, so to speak. What are the real challenges on the ground in terms of developing and implementing nutrient management plans that are critical for the N2O piece and soil health for that matter? So thank you, Trish.
Well, I thank Michelle for the pre-meeting meetings so that we could get our heads together and tell a fairly consistent story. And thanks to Chris for taking time to talk last week about what he was going to present so I could segue into it. And after our discussion, we decided based on our discussion that talking about some of the tools that have already been developed was probably a good thing to talk about now. Now, my information and focus is primarily Maryland. I've coordinated a nutrient management program for the university under contract with MDA since 1993. So my focus will clearly be on what we do here. You guys can talk about voluntary, but since 1998, nutrient management in Maryland has been regulatory. So we've passed the voluntary stage and gone into the next phase of life. Why do we have what we have? And that's interesting because I tend to look at things historically and futuristically too. We have what we have because there's been enough acreage on a specific crop to justify research efforts. And we've had people who are interested in looking at it and funding to answer those questions. Don't think that we've answered all the questions out there because I get many, many questions every month that there are no answers for because no one's looked at them yet. But we have a patchwork of tools as well as interpretations that vary from state to state. And I think that is one of our limitations in convincing our producers to take our advice. So I'm going to talk about tools in terms of what we can do pre-season. And that'll answer the question, do I need nitrogen and how much? What we can do in season, is there information out there to tell me whether I need more or don't need more, and if I need more, how much? And then late season, can I look back at what I did and determine whether I added too much nitrogen or not? And I'm going to talk first about the existing tools and end up talking about what I call the emerging tools. Okay, pre-season. We have one test in Maryland that's been recognized as a reliable pre-season test, and it's only for wheat, and it's only for the fall application of nitrogen on wheat, which is not much nitrogen when you think about it. It's 30 pounds, but there's a fair acreage of wheat in Maryland, and that can be a significant savings. The test has only been calibrated for wheat and barley, not the other small grains, rye, for example. And fortunately, it has been adapted for the traditional 8-inch soil fertility test. So someone can go out and take the sample to see if they need nitrogen for their wheat and also have their fertility sample for the rest of the work that needs to be done. And it's a very valuable test, really, because it tells you whether there's enough nitrogen left over from your summer crop to get your wheat started. All right. In many cases, especially after soybeans or after a year where we haven't had optimal nitrogen, there is enough nitrogen left over in the soil from the corn or from the soybean crop to supply that fall nitrogen requirement only for the wheat. All right. Another test is the on corn, and this is, I believe, our #1 crop in Maryland anyway, and that's the pre-sidedress nitrate test. And we have Jack Meisinger, who's sitting in the office, in the audience, to thank us for that. He's the one that, in my opinion, brought this down from New England and worked with the soil fertility specialists at the time to get this calibrated for Maryland. And let me say that calibrating it for your own state is really important when you're talking to farmers. They don't give a flip what happened in Vermont or Iowa or Georgia or Kansas. They want to know what you found here, and they want to know that it works in your state, in their state, with their soils and their conditions. So this taking a test that someone else worked on and bringing it into your own state and your own ag community is very, very important. What this does is tell a producer who has a certain history in his cropping and nutrient history whether or not he needs additional nitrogen while there's still time to put it on, while the corn is still short enough that you can get in there with side dress equipment. Okay? So it's done at a rather warm time of the year, and if we haven't had rain, the soils are pretty hard. But when the corn is between 6 and 12 inches tall, you take a 12-inch depth sample and analyze it for nitrogen. Now, in Maryland, we have our extension officers are equipped, and I practice with my folks every year who run this test to prepare them for testing season. It can be a daunting job, though, to take 12-inch samples in June if we haven't had any rain. What does it tell us? It tells us whether or not there's enough nitrogen in the system from the manure or the organic waste we've been using, or from the cover crop that may have been grown over the winter, or from the previous season's forage legume, whether or not there's enough nitrogen or not in that system for corn. So you basically get an yes, I have enough. No, I don't have enough. And if there's an inadequate amount due to some additional work done in the mid-90s, we can now tell the farmer how much needs to add. It's important that this test be done every year, and that's something that's been really hard to get through to farmers. They get it done once, it worked for them, and they think it's going to be good every year. There's tremendous variability in mineralization rates over seasons and over sources and over soils, and it really needs to be done every year. All right. Where can it be used? And this is one of our limitations. It can be done for corn, grain, and silage, which are major crops here. It can be used only if an organic source like manure or biosolids was applied to the crop or to the previous years, or if a forage legume was grown the previous season, or if a winter legume cover crop was grown. It's never been calibrated for fertilizer-only situations. And this is where we get into the problem with different states taking different perspectives and having different recommendations. Delaware apparently has it calibrated for fertilizer only. And realize that in Maryland, we have people that farm on both sides of the state line. And they really do not understand why one state has one recommendation and across the line there's another one. All right. Here's one that's an interesting one. The late season tissue test, we basically had limited amount of Maryland research on this. Dr. Bob Cradaville had included some in his research plots, but NRCS decided to cost share this practice one year, and people were supposed to follow University of Maryland recommendations. So we scuttled around, did a literature review, and based on the limited data and the research data done elsewhere, came up with a way to use it here. We only use it as an excess, not excess. We do not recommend based on the excess amount. This is what you might call a post-mortem or a retrospective assessment. You take a corn stalk sample at black layer, which is physiological maturity, and you look at the nitrate in it, and it tells you whether or not you put on too much nitrogen the season before. It really only makes sense to use it if you've had a decent year. If you have a drought year, you already know you have too much nitrogen in your system, and there's no sense of spending the time to take the sample or the money to get it analyzed, right? But it can tell you whether you have applied too much in a decent year, because the nitrate is accumulated in the stalk. And it's very important important, just like all these tests are calibrated for specific conditions, just like the PSNT needs to be taken to 12 inches, this stock sample needs to be taken in the right place, because some group of graduate students in the Midwest segmented other parts and found that there's tremendous variability as you go up the stalk. So it's got to be taken between 6 inches above the ground to 8 inches on top of that. All right. Now, emerging in-season stuff. This is where the real future is, especially on the big farms. Optical sensors, optical active sensors like GreenSeeker and Crop Circle. They allow you to come in and not only see whether, given this year's weather conditions, you need nitrogen, but they can also pinpoint where you need more or less in a field. A colleague at University of Maryland was working on this, but unfortunately his work wasn't pulled into formal publication or recommendations before he left. So while there has been work done in Maryland, it's not to the point where it can be integrated into regulations yet. And remember, we're a mandatory nutrient management state. Plans have to be done according to regulations. If there's not a publication from the University of Maryland that says this is the way to go, it's not going to be put in regs and farmers aren't going to be able to use it without a research exemption, okay? So here's some of the challenges. We need new tools or expanded tools. Are there other crops we could do an early season soil nitrate test for, all right? We need to remove the impediments to existing tools. PSNT is not used anywhere near as much as it should be. A lot of that is due to the fact that in some counties there is no ag service provider who has side dress equipment, or he has limited side dress equipment and he'll only use it for the big farmers, not the smaller farmers, okay? So we have infrastructural limitations, and we really need to work regionally on designing the experiments and doing the research and giving the recommendations, so we don't have differences across state line for someone that farms in Maryland and Delaware, or Maryland and Pennsylvania, or Pennsylvania and New York State. So, you know, I'm not the soil fertility specialist. I'm a nutrient management specialist. I'm an extension educator, but I see, and I love them all. I respect them all, but we got to work together across state lines. I will say, and I'm very glad Michelle invited me today, it is invaluable to have collaborative efforts between ARS people and land grant scientists and soils. We would not have what we have in Maryland without that. We wouldn't have the basic phosphorus data that comes out of the watershed lab. We wouldn't have PSNT. We wouldn't have improved ammonia volatilization stuff without the work of people here, primarily in the nitrogen scene, Dr. Jack Meisinger. I love you, Jack. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Trish. I think our charge is maybe clear, but it's still huge. And so a couple points. I'll be facilitating discussion. And I want to make another point, though, that besides the fact that we clearly have way too many topics to discuss in the remaining 42 minutes, this session essentially continues in the afternoon with the field COP session. And I want to point out Dr. Kurt Dell, who's going to be leading that discussion, and that'll also be here after lunch. And so those of you that are in this group, we can continue that conversation then. The other thing I want to quickly comment on is Eric Hoffman, who I introduced earlier, is going to be helping me facilitate the conversation. He's going to be standing up here with highlighting the major points that come out of the conversation. I want to start off first, though, by asking if there's any clarification questions that anyone wants to ask to any of the panelists or to the group as a whole. And I guess Megan's going to be with the microphone here. Thank you. Super.
Thanks very much. It's kind of a basic question. As I understand correctly, our goal is within the agroforestry sector for the northeastern area to reduce through mitigation or adaptation the greenhouse gas emissions for this section by X amount by 2025, using 2005 as a baseline. I'm sure this has already been done, and you forgive my ignorance, but perhaps someone from the Climate Hub or someone from Bill Hohenstein's office can share to us what that 2005 baseline data actually is, because without that information, of course, we wouldn't know how much more mitigation and or adaptation we would need and for which sectors. So can you just share that information with us?
Is there anybody other than me that can? Joel, you're half raising your hand.
To you. So that's actually a big question that we're trying to work on, because the formal way that we nationally measure greenhouse gas emissions is through the greenhouse gas inventory process, which USDA contributes to both on the agriculture side and on the forestry side. And what we found in going back and taking a closer look at that is that we don't have a great understanding of how much these kinds of practices are being adopted across the country. So things like permanent no-till, for example, which the permanence piece of that has a huge impact on carbon sequestration, or the use of some of these more advanced nitrogen management products, things like that. We don't track very well, partially because that's a relatively new technology and you can do a national sample and not pick any of that up because it's not being used very, very much and you would just miss somebody. So what we're actually doing is we're working with a variety of the statistical agencies and the research agencies within USDA and trying to find data sets that we're collecting that we can pull in that would provide more information on that. So the ARMS survey that ERS and NASS administer does have some data on things like tillage practices, the use of precision agriculture. APHIS has some surveys on manure management that we're looking at. And then we're also looking to external groups like CTIC to see what they might be able to provide. So is that not it's looking like it's not answering your question.
Dave Hollinger.
Yeah, that's an important question, but it's also a difficult one. I think on balance, the Northeast is one of the few regions which is a net sink for greenhouse gases, but that's totally due to the forest growth that's occurring. So it's a net source of nitrous oxide and obviously a net source of methane. As Joel said, coming up with a defensible sort of inventory is difficult because you're extrapolating small scale studies. That has been done within the Northeast by, I guess the USDA contracted with, was it ICF International to do that. So there are some figures out there. I can't remember them off the top of my head. I think on the order for nitrous oxide, it's on the order of 7 teragrams equivalent of CO2, and methane was somewhat larger, maybe twice that. Those numbers are in the Northeast Climate Hub Vulnerability Assessment, which is available from the USDA, and it's online. And there's an appendix in the sort of back of that, which was produced by ICF, which has the greenhouse gas inventory for the Northeast, and each region has their own inventory. In terms of defending those numbers, then you'd have to go back to the source, but that's what we have to work with at this point.
Is that in the Northeast, most of the nitrous oxide emissions actually come from nitrification and not from application of nitrogen fertilizer. And so the approaches that we would take to address that would be very different than kind of blanket recommendations on nitrogen fertilizer use. So versus the Midwest, where the vast majority of their nitrous oxide emissions are coming from that. So that's actually part of what we're hoping the discussion here can start. It's not going to be the end of the discussion, but given the local profiles and where the sources are, what are some options for the particular region?
So I have kind of a general question then. It sounds like for the building blocks, it's almost like you guys need more regional data is that a fair statement? I mean, and as an ALS person, I have no self-interest in that, of course. But that, I mean, that's the purpose of this session, is to identify kind of what would be the next steps that make sense to kind of build the building block, so to speak. Thanks. Anybody, and who's next?
Thanks. My name is John Nijelski. I'm the state director for the Massachusetts Farm Service Agency. So my question is for Doug. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit. You had a bullet point about, can crop insurance be used to reduce ag risks associated with greenhouse gas offsets? That really intrigued me because with the Farm Bill, as many of you know, my agency received kind of a boost to our non-insured crop disaster assistance program, otherwise known as NAP. And also RMA got a little bump to their program as well with their whole farm revenue protection program. On the NAP side, we have done, used to just be catastrophic coverage that farmers could get with that program. We now allowed folks to buy up coverage on their crops. We also provided free catastrophic coverage for new and beginning farmers, and also reduced premiums on the buy-up. So we've been charged with going out talking about these tools that we have. So we're looking at any way we can focus in on getting more folks to come in the door. And I see here a communication opportunity. As Dave Cleaves mentioned this morning, you know, our agency has 2,100 offices, county offices around the country. We have direct relationships with farmers who come into our doors several times a year, minimum, where we can talk to them not just about our programs, but about our sister agency programs. So I wonder if you can maybe just elaborate a little bit on that bullet point, because I see an opportunity here.
This is difficult. There's no program that's more difficult to understand probably than crop insurance. And there are so many products in the structure itself with the private insurance companies and agents, the subsidies, and then the farmer in the middle of all this. Having said that, again, it's pretty, the bullet is pretty shallow. There's not a lot of depth to it. And the thought is that if there are risks associated in a market that allows agricultural offsets, can we somehow reduce those risks so they're more desirable to the power plants or whatever is being regulated through a risk management product of some kind? And I'm not sure how it would work, quite frankly, but that's the job of this group, I guess. It's just a thought.
Well, I'd like to ask Chris a question. I guess you were in the group that worked on the building blocks. So I'm always curious as to how a baseline year is chosen. Why 2005? Was it the year of a treaty or a year a promise was made, or why 2005? Why not 2000?
So 2005, it was actually based on the previous set of international negotiations, so going back to the Kyoto Protocol. So that was why that year was chosen.
But the Kyoto folks maybe did. Bill, where are you? Who's next? There's lots on the table. Let me try to direct things a little bit then, at the expense of not knowing what the heck I'm doing here. Soil health is essentially about CO2 mitigation, and nitrogen stewardship is essentially about N2O mitigation, right? So we're talking about CO2 and N2O. Should we focus on one versus the other? Is one more important than the other? Open question to the group. Are they both important? Should we focus on both, or do we?
I just have a question to the group, and it goes back to a previous speaker. If we have to sell this to the farmer, I mean, I don't think we're selling any of that. We're selling profitability, sustainability, resilience. And is that what we need when we go out to our stakeholder?
Yeah, as a scientist who does N2O research and as a scientist who does a fair amount of outreach, I rarely, if ever, talk about N2O because farmers are not managing for N2O. In fact, I was asked that question during a job interview once at a university. Are farmers going to manage for N2O? And I said, no. As you know, I'm an ALS scientist and I don't work at that university. But the better answer, in retrospect, I'd spent all my time working in the lab on mechanisms controlling N2O, so I wasn't really thinking about the big picture. But the big picture is, of course they will, because they're going to try to improve nitrogen use efficiency. And as a side benefit, we get the N2O benefits. So as Chris mentioned, there's some economic value to increasing nitrogen use efficiency, right? There's still a lot of challenges. The challenges include using nitrogen as an insurance, right? Nitrogen's relatively cheap. That farmers don't necessarily listen to extension folks. They might listen to the salesperson more, right? There's literature on that in the soils, in the social sciences. So there's a lot of challenges to even something that seems like it might make sense. And not with the goal of N2O reduction, but with the goal with an economic benefit. So that's where I would like the conversation to go, if possible, is this discussion of how the person that's talking to the farmer introduces this topic. Is it doable? I guess is kind of my question, but Norm was next, I think.
Okay, well, I wanted to make a few comments about your question about whether the nitrogen stewardship can move by itself or soil health can move by itself. You can make improvements by doing that, but to really be effective, the two of them are kind of go hand in hand. And I'll give you an example is as you're developing a nutrient management plan, one, to start out with, you got to know what crops you're going to grow. So immediately you're into, what crops, and what crops are grown depends on how you're going to maintain or sustain or improve the health of that soil. So you have to know crops first. And then as you go through a nutrient management planning process, I think what you will find out as you get some diversity in that crop rotation, you probably get some synergistic effects of the nutrients in that soil, which improves the efficiency of your nutrients, specifically nitrogen in this case. And then as you get into cover crops, that's another way of managing nitrogen. So crops, nutrients, soil health, nutrient management, nitrogen stewardship, they converge and they have to march together, or you have something out of sync.
Did everybody hear that? You get both the CO2 and N2O benefits. And frankly, that's why we did combine these two in this conversation. That's why we're combining them in the cropping systems. And this afternoon, we do want to talk a little bit about more of the challenges. Sometimes you meet one of those goals, but you do the opposite with the other one, right? And so we're going to keep that kind of conversation for later. But for now, let's just focus on these two. And we have a question in the back. Or a comment.
I guess it's a little bit more of a comment, but I think that something that we need to think about when we're talking about soil health and stewardship and grower interest and adoption, I think, I mean, particularly in the case of tools like cover crops, these are multifunctional tools, and cover crops are, to see that large scale adoption, I think producers are going to be more tuned into immediate benefits. I mean, we've been pushing soil health and talking about that for a while. We've been talking about legacy and management and soil conservation. But generally still with growers, I mean, we're at 1.5% at cover crop adoption across the country. So it's still really small. I know Maryland, it feels like everybody's adopting cover crops, but across the country, we're at 1.5%. So to move that dial, you're looking at more, not just selling soil health, but selling other services that have more immediate benefits that growers are tuned into, like water availability and crop stress, like nitrogen, immediate benefits, because that's what growers are tuned into. And it's still hard right now. I know there's a lot of movement with soil health, but it's still hard to get that to sell to growers.
And I think that's an inherent point, Joel. I'm speaking for you guys and Rachel and Randy. That seems to be an inherent part of how the building blocks were put together, and that, in a sense, the goal is greenhouse gas mitigation, but the sell is not greenhouse gas mitigation. Is that fair? And so then the question, the conversation is, how do you get more conservation across the landscape? Because we're really talking about conservation at many levels, right? Anybody else?
Chris, I was wondering if there's any thought been given to targeting geographic areas for getting more nutrient management done. And I'm asking because a recent November trip to Western Minnesota sort of shocked me on both the carbon and nitrogen fronts by the amount of fall tillage, no cover crops, and nitrogen application in the fall. And I just thought, wow. And the local field office staff is trying to write grants to get buses to take them over to North Dakota where they're doing cover cropping. So we have these cultural areas that have not adopted a lot of these conservation practices. So I was just wondering if a geographic targeted approach might help get a big bang.
They're not in that, well, they're part of that 1.5 acres, but they're certainly making that number a lot higher, as does Maryland or the Mid-Atlantic area. I took it out of the slide. I mean, there are some geographic areas that are initially going to be targeted. I think a low-hanging fruit, easy place to start is with corn in the Midwest. And since this was the Northeast workshop, I didn't want to talk about corn in the Midwest, but since you asked. But I mean, obviously there has to be some targeting for this to work. The early adopters, the low-hanging fruit, I mean, you're going to see those people jump on board first. Steve and I had a conversation. I mean, I'm not sure about those late adopters. I like calling them never adopters. I don't know what we do with those people to try to bring them on board, but when we target, we can target in different ways. We can target geographically, like you're saying, and then we can get at some problems, whether it's Western Lake Erie Basin, whether it's the Upper Mississippi River Valley, Chesapeake Bay. I mean, those are all natural areas that, for many programs, we're already targeting activities. And like we're saying, we're not targeting greenhouse gas emissions. We're targeting better conservation, better and more nutrient management. So we're hoping with the activities and the building blocks to bring more tools to the table to affect this change.
Good. I guess I wanted to make the comment. The question was asked, you know, what are some of the... Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Norman Widman with NRCS. Some of the barriers that we need to overcome, I think, as the government is kind of rethinking our current business plans and how we do business. And I can say perhaps within NRCS, we've always had this very tight way of doing things where we kind of like to do it ourselves and do it right. Well, we can do that, but you only do it with a few people. The challenge before us here involves the masses, and we need to change our business plan a little bit. And by that, I guess what I'm getting at is through partnerships. And yesterday, the nitrogen stewardship group had a session with the private sector, and they are geared up and ready to go. It's going to probably cause our government agency to kind of rethink how we do some things and what we can accept. But the private sector sees the advantage, not just in the greenhouse gas, but the private sector is seeing, look at what we can do and get some credit for it. So again, I think in government, we need to kind of rethink some of the ways we do business, work with our partners. It's not just the private sector from the standpoint of the ones that sell nutrients or consultants, but a lot of NGOs are pushing this as well. So work with everybody, and it's going to make our job easier.
Hi, my name is Fernando. I'm with NRCS in Connecticut, and I'm not sure if these questions can be answered here, but I put it out to the state if they wanted some questions answered to get back to me, and the state soil scientist there said wanted to know if there are any other properties besides carbon that they should be collecting or assessing to add to their soils database, like thermal conductivity, for example. She also wanted to know if there are any funds to support new scan sites. Last one she said was hearing a lot about coastal changes. Is NRCS looking into soil interp or practice needs of coastal subaqueous customers as well as just information needs?
Can you clarify that last one for the group a little bit, in that we're not all living in a coastal area? Does that have to do with rising sea levels or saltwater intrusion, or, you know?
Yeah.
Or both?
I think it was levels of coastal waters. She didn't clarify beyond that. Is NRCS looking to adding solar, geothermal, wind practices to mitigate climate change? That was the only other question. But
could everybody hear that? Could you repeat that? Sorry. Put the microphone a little closer to your mouth if you don't mind.
Sure. I think there's a lot of questions that I've already asked, but the final one was, is NRCS looking into adding solar, geothermal, or wind practices to mitigate climate change? But that's...
Gotcha. Is there anybody in the room comfortable and happy answering that question? He did preface the question with there might not be the answer to this, so you've opened that up. But Norm Widman.
As we get into, well, it's not for this group, but as they get into some of the forestry growth and retention into those building blocks, part of the strategy there is, and there's a silviculture component to that. And to some degree, that's to help regulate wind and temperature in pastures, as well as there's going to be a windbreak component to it. That obviously begins to affect the wind speed and the effect that has not only on erosion, but crop growth.
This is Joel Larson. The energy generation and efficiency building block, which that track is also going on, or that discussion is going on right now, does look specifically at some of those renewable energy technologies and authorities for getting that in place. Part of what we're looking at with that building block in particular is ways in which, for example, NRCS and rural business and community services, respective authorities and funding streams can complement each other. So are there things that NRCS can do to improve energy efficiency on farm or within rural, and then within rural development, are there things that they can do because they primarily service utility providers to improve utility energy efficiency or install new low carbon energy generation? Well, so the answer is yes. I mean, we're looking at it as part of the building blocks. I don't know within NRCS if there's a discussion on practice standards specifically for those. I can't speak to that, but across the entire agent or department, that's very much something that we're looking at.
Noel Gallahan with NRCS. One of the things I get to do or have to do, depending on your point of view, is I meet with international people that come in and talk about, hey, have questions, they have issues, they want to know more about our programs and so on. So I'm going to relate a little bit about a fascinating discussion recently had with an Australian who is a large farmer and in the agricultural ministry. And it evolved into this discussion that they do not have subsidized crop insurance. And what that has driven is that has driven farms to diversify. So every farm has 10, 15 crops. Every farm has livestock. What that does is that generates a need for rotations, that generates a need for cover crops for winter feed for livestock, that generates a whole raft of other responses to the fact that they can no longer have a monetized crop system because they can't afford the insurance if they're just growing corn and soybeans. They can't afford the insurance on that. So they have other crops and other things as well. And I thought that was a very interesting observation that sometimes we look past, I think, as we're talking about ways to improve soil health. You know, if you put a little economic incentive behind that or remove an economic disincentive, you might do a whole lot. So I just wanted to relay that conversation, that discussion with you. I thought it was very interesting, and I thought I'd pass it on.
My name is Betsy Ricola. I'm with the Agricultural Marketing Service. I think I might actually be the only AMS employee participating in the event. But I wanted to pick up on something that Norm mentioned about just working with a broader group of stakeholders and thinking about how we do business. With AMS's programs, we do have certainly programs that work with sort of the more traditional sectors of agriculture, but we also have a lot of programs that tend to work with people in the local and organic spaces, a lot of new and beginning farmers. And talk about challenges for getting information out there about these things and incentivizing and, showing what the immediate benefits are. I think a lot of these groups have an interest in doing the right thing and certainly want to contribute to goals like mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and other things, but they are not groups that tend to look at the federal government as a cooperative partner. There are some historical reasons that sometimes back up that assumption. And then also with the other networks that we tend to look at for disseminating information like crop advisors, I mean, those folks are generally not speaking to these audiences. So it presents a real challenge for figuring out how we disseminate these pieces of information. I think particularly when you've got sectors that tend to be very small, very diffuse. It's not like you can just go to one group and then get the information out to all of the stakeholders. So, thinking about farmer adoption and incentivizing, what are those immediate benefits that we can sell to people, particularly if they are, just entering the sector, oftentimes are not actually coming from a farmer background. I think it presents a real challenge and one that we need to think about as we are rolling these things out. And I just wanted to mention to the point of crop insurance, since sometimes that's our favorite group to beat on. I will say that I think that the Risk Management Agency has done a lot to try to roll out tools that work better for the diversified sectors of agriculture. And I think FSA and NAP are also doing a lot of work on this as well. Things like the whole farm tool, a lot of the ways that RMA has worked to incorporate things like organic prices and is starting to look at things like local prices. Obviously, there are bigger issues there, but I think that I've heard the Risk Management Agency talking a lot about how the diversified agricultural systems do mitigate risk and how they're trying to adapt their crop insurance systems to recognize that and reward that behavior more. So it's not to say that we've achieved it, but I think they are making progress towards those goals.
I stole the mic before it got there. It's okay. This is more of a comment, kind of a story. Just a reminder that there are other players out there on this issue of nutrient management in soil, and that would be state departments of agriculture and state legislatures, which often don't know much about these things, but go ahead and write laws that aren't in sync with maybe what we're doing or with what the state departments of agriculture are doing. And in Massachusetts, we have an example like that. We recently had the legislature pass some I guess you could use the word onerous nutrient management regulations that has set the farmers all on edge because they look at the regulations and they see they don't even really correspond with what UMass Extension scientists have put forward as best practices. So this was done before the current State Department head of agriculture came in, and he's had to answer for this thing that he didn't create. And farmers are waiting for answers. So what is that? How does that concern us? Well, basically, again, I mentioned before, FSA has a lot of county offices around the country. So farmers come and they talk to us and they say, well, what do you know about this? We say, well, it's not our bailiwick. However, I think we can get folks from UMass Extension, we can get State Department of Agriculture folks, and we can get NRCS and other partners together in a room to talk it over with you. So there's a barrier there, but there's an opportunity here as well where each of us can act as conveners to have these discussions with folks in our state and make sure we're all on the same page. So.
Lou Ziska, USDA ARS. I love the insurance comment, and I think that's incredibly insightful and spot on. I would also, however, point out that insurance goes both ways in the sense that if I were a farmer and I wanted to switch to no-till, and I had concerns about being able to maintain production under a no-till system, I could have insurance be part of that, say a 5-year window, so that any difference between my best 5 years and my switching over to no-till might be compensated for until I adopt that new practice. So insurance can be, in fact, an incentive if it's used properly, as opposed to a disincentive to adopt new practices.
This is Dave Cleaves from the Forest Service. I go back, let's say 57 years ago when I was in a science fair contest. And my science fair contest was my dad. I didn't drive yet, at least according to his knowledge, I wasn't driving yet, on the farm. He drove me around and we looked at conservation practices and I took pictures and we interpreted them. And the leader at that time was Soil Conservation Service, and they were creating a demand for conservation practices. And it was a beautiful thing on the landscape, mainly contour farming and strip cropping and cover crops. Not what we would call cover crops today, but my father liked to plow things down to dust. So it was impressive compared to kind of how I grew up. But so we had a notion, just as we do in forestry today, of what good forest management is. And what we struggle with in the forest community is how do you bring something like CO2 management, carbon sequestration, into our vision of what good practices are. But it's there anyway. That's the most maddening damn thing about it. I mean, carbon sequestration really is an indicator of good management. It means that the forest is growing. But that is not such a simple concept to bring across to a vision that we already have of what good management is, because it's already kind of crowded in there. You know, we know what we're managing for. Now you're telling us that we have to manage for carbon also. Well, what does that mean? What are we going to have to give up? And they go directly in the communication perception to trade-offs when there might be just as many complementarities as there are trade-offs there. So I think there's some, if we go back to the original, work that Rogers and Shoemaker and the folks did on, years ago on innovation diffusion, I think part of what we have to be able to communicate is understand the characteristics of the innovation that we're trying to talk about. The simplicity, the relative advantages, the trialability, the observability, the observability and compatibility with values. And I think as we bring each kind of piece into an overall vision of what good management is, we need to kind of understand what we already understand. Sometimes we don't kind of bring it up in read-only memory and kind of review what we already know about how to lead this vision of conservation practices. So we're struggling with the same thing in the forest management field. How do you piggyback some of these concepts, in this case of carbon management or CO2 management, into what you already have as a vision of good management? So
Any final parting comments? We have about 5 minutes left, and we're going to be invaded by people that want to eat lunch soon. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Eric, do you have that up here? Those. We are recording you all, so we do have that. But that does raise a good point. We'll add it. Eric's adding it now, and we do want the afternoon session to be a continuation of this, so that we don't have to start all over again with these issues.
In our plan for the focus for the afternoon was to specifically look at that balance between, sequestering carbon in the soil and controlling N2O. So yeah, we'll hit that hard this afternoon.
Excellent. Very good. Boy, it's almost as if we planned this. I want to make one more point, especially for the panelists, those 4 panelists. And I know, Doug, are you back tomorrow for the economic session? No, you're not. Okay. So maybe Doug, we can talk after this, but we are asking the panelists to go to the 14th floor because there's a beautiful view up there. But more importantly, there is also a person that's going to videotape aspects of your talk, and she knows what to do. It's a matter of you making it up there. If you're not a USDA person, you need to be escorted by somebody like me. We can talk about that later, but touch base with me if you're a panelist and you need more information about that. Anything else? Any final parting comments? We have 3 minutes.
Michelle, I'll just add, I tried to capture all the top line opportunities and challenges here on the paper. If I missed anything or mischaracterized something, please let me know or fix it yourself. We're going to use these for the report outs, I believe after lunch, and then going into the notes after the meeting. Yeah, and then if there's anything else that's missing here that we didn't discuss, also please feel free to add that as well. We'll make sure it gets incorporated into the report out and notes and all of that. So thanks.
Also, continue this conversation during lunch. We will have large white Post-it pages up on these boards on the side. If you've thought of something, write it up there somewhere. Write it down, get it to us, put it on a small Post-it, on a big Post-it, but get it to us.
Thank you all. We're going to start back at 1 o'clock. Lunch is in the back. It just needs to be uncovered. This is a do-it-yourself kind of thing. Feel free to help Katrina with that. I'm going to let you go 2 minutes ahead of time. How's that? Thank you very much, everybody.